Hi everyone, this is Professor Hai Nguyen, and I want to welcome you to my tutorial video for midterm number one. So in this video, I want to somewhat go over the objectives of midterm number one and just to explain to you the test format and how to prepare for it, how I will be grading you, and what my expectations are, and ultimately just to give you advice on how to be successful on this midterm, if you will. And again, the midterm itself is, it's a tall task. It's a tall task I'm asking you to do. But it's not a new task that I'm asking you to do. So let's talk about your midterm number one. But before we talk about midterm number one, let's talk about the technology component that you will need in order for you to take complete midterm number one, okay? So in terms of the technology component, this is a proctor exam. It is part of the authentication of online courses here at Evergreen Valley College. And basically, we want to make sure that it's you, right? It's really who you are that have signed up for the class and taken the class, and you're not using somebody else to complete the task for you. So this is part of the verification process that we have on campus. And a way to really make this class fully online, you will need the following items. Obviously, you need a computer. You also need a computer with a webcam, internet access. You also need a special web browser. It's Google Chrome. If you are not on Google Chrome, if you have Safari or Mozilla, Firefox, or anything of that nature, you will need to download Google Chrome. This is the browser that is compatible with somewhat the Proctorial Extension. So you're gonna also need to download the Proctorial Extension. It's a free extension from Google Chrome, really to proctor an exam for online universities, if you will, and online courses. So the instructions are here for you to somewhat complete the technology component, but yes, computer, webcam, Google Chrome, internet access, Proctorial Extension, and ultimately, you need also a form of ID when you are ready to take the test. Basically, you're just going to show your ID to the webcam to basically let me know that it is you who has taken the test. And once you start the test, what I have done is I have set the settings to where you can't open up a new tab on your web browser, because I don't want you to be distracted. I just have bad experiences with students in the middle of the test, panicking, and they go on Wikipedia and they're just copying stuff onto their on their midterms, if you will. So I just want you to stay focused, and I want you to focus on the task at hand and not to be rummaging through online materials while you're taking the test. So again, you need an ID, and also when you start the test, your webcam will be on. Okay, it will record you the entire time while you're taking the test, and your web browser will ultimately prevent you from opening up a new tab, if you will, right? And once you're done with the test, then everything goes back to normal. And again, guys, this is not spyware. I'm asking you to install onto your computer. It's not spyware, guys. It's basically to make sure that it is you who has taken the test, and it's part of the verification process, and to really make this class fully online. Because if we don't have this technology, then you will have to come on campus to take an exam. That is just part of policy here at Evergreen Valley College. So I just want to make that clear. So before you prepare for this assignment, please make sure that you have all of the technology component fulfilled, okay? So if you are watching this video, I hope you watch the entire video, because in this video, I want to explain to you everything you will need to do and give you some advice on how I would somewhat approach this assignment. Because again, it's not a new task I'm asking you to do, but it is a harder task, right? But just a quick recap from what you have learned from the class so far. So let's talk about what you have learned in the class so far, right? In the textbook, you have read chapters 16 through 22, covering more than 60 years, almost 60 years of American history. We started our journey looking at Reconstruction period in the 1860s. We have made it through, we progress in chapter 17, looking at Western expansion and its impact on Native Americans. And then ultimately, I believe in chapter 18 and 19, looking at the process of industrialization. This is where America really become an industrialized society. And also with the responses to industrialization with populism and progressivism, okay? So let me go back to the main page here. And then ultimately we looked at America expansion overseas, right? We looked at America expansion overseas into the Caribbean, into Cuba, into Puerto Rico, and into the Pacific, right? Hawaii, the Philippines. So American expansion on a global stage, and then ultimately in chapter 22, looking at America's involvement during World War I. So it's a lot of content, right? 60 years of American history from the Reconstruction period all the way up to World War I. And of course, in the modules 1 through 5, basically we have looked at those time periods, but you have somewhat dive deeper into somewhat certain themes or certain concepts that I want you to focus on, if you will. So modules 1 through 5, basically a deep dive into those time periods individually. So that's basically what you have done in the course so far, right? Modules 1 through 5, chapter reading 16 through 22. And that's basically what your first midterm is going to cover. It's going to require you to reassess, right? And reanalyze everything you have learned, and ultimately asking you to do the same thing that you did in the modules assignment, right? Looking at primary resources, if you will, to help you construct a thesis, answer a question that I'm asking, and ultimately using the sources as your evidence. That is it, guys. Like, that's basically what this test is about in a nutshell. It's the same thing you've been doing from the modules assignment 1 through 5, right? But except this time around, what you're going to be doing is that it's time pressure, and I'm asking you to write a longer essay, right? If you notice in the modules, a lot of the modules, I said it's a minimum of 500 words, minimum, okay? That's about 2 pages of standard college writing, double space, 12-point font, if you will. So 500 words for every module assignment so far you have done in the class. For the midterm, I'm asking you to do is write 1,000 words, right? 1,000 words, so it's around 4 to 5 pages, if you will. This is why I say I know what I'm asking you is a tall task, but it's possible, right? This is my, about 6 or 7 years now teaching online history. So I have made, majority of my students, they do pass the class, right? They do somewhat succeed on this test. And you look at it, don't be intimidated, guys. 1,000 words. What is it really? 1,000 words. If you divide that by the 2-hour limit that you have, 120 minutes, 1,000 words divided by 120 minutes, that is an average that you have of, I'm expecting to write an average of 8.5 words per minute. 8.5 words per minute. That's not a tall task at all. If you really think about it, that's actually a very slow, somewhat, that's a low expectation that I have, that ultimately I'm asking you to write an average of 8.5 words per minute. I mean, guys, I grew up in the 90s. I know typing can be a challenge, if you will. That was back in the 90s when we didn't have computers. It's 2018, it's 2020, right? We're 30 years removed from those time periods that I grew up in, you will. So I'm not buying it that students today are slow typers or anything like that. No, I'm not buying it, because why? By you signing up for our online class, what you are telling me is that you are proficient at technology, you are proficient at reading, you are proficient at writing, and that's what basically an online history course is, guys. I mean, at the end of the day, you're not going to class, you're not listening to me lecture or anything like that. Basically, this is what an online course is. You read material, and ultimately you utilize the things that you read to answer a question, right? And answering a question, basically you got to type it out, because the fact that I don't see you, the only communication we have is in writing. And at the end of the day, that's what it is, guys. So I'm sorry to break the news to you if it wasn't clear in my orientation, but this is what the class is about. So it is a tall task that I'm asking you to do, but I think it's very doable. 8.5 words per minute, guys. And I know writing can be a challenge for some of you, but this is where preparation is key. My tests, especially this format, so we call this the document-based question exam, okay? What you will need to do is you will need to utilize the documents that I have assigned below on this page, if you will, right? Use it as part of your essay response, okay? So it's a document-based question exam. You have to type 1,000 words minimum. You have to use at least 6 out of the 8 documents that I have assigned. And for every document that you don't use, below the 6 minimum quota, there is a deduction of 25 points. So you want to make sure you get those 6 documents in there as part of your analysis, guys, because that is key, right? I'm looking, are you able to exercise the skills that historians specialize in, right? Because at the end of the day, basically this class is to teach you history, but is also to teach you how to use or to get you to practice the skills that historians we specialize in, right? So you have documents there that you will have to analyze. So it's a lot of things you have to do. And this is the type of test you do not start without preparation. You do not start very last minute, guys. I'm warning you right now because this essay needs to be cohesive. It needs to also be comprehensive, right? I need to understand your thesis. I need to understand your writing, your essay, right? If I have to read your essay twice or 3 times to understand the points you are trying to make, that's very troubling, if you will, right? So at the end of the day, you have to be able to write, guys, because this is an online course. And the only way I grade you is based on your writing. So look, midterm number 1, it's a document-based question exam. And at the end of the day, it's the same skills. It's the same thing that you have been doing in the modules assignment, except it's longer and I'm putting you under a time limit, right? 2 hours. You have 2 hours to type me an essay, a minimum of 1,000 words that will answer the question that I am posing to you. And in your essay response, you will need to utilize at least 6 out of the 8 documents that I have assigned and ultimately synthesize the content, themes, and concept, and also key terms, relevant key terms to go along with the documents to tell me a fuller, more comprehensive story, right, of somewhat the history that you have learned and apply it to answer the question. So it's a lot of tasks that you're going to be doing, guys. Reading, synthesizing, and ultimately constructing a thesis and ultimately conveying your ideas to let me know how you have understood American history from the 1860s to the end of World War I. So that's basically what this test is about, guys. All right. So preparation. The key is preparation. Set aside as much time as possible to prepare for this project, if you will. Okay. So let's dive right into it, guys. So let me go down here. So I already kind of gave you an idea of what the test format will be, right? Document-based question exam. You have 2 hours, minimum of 1,000 words, all right? And ultimately, you will have to utilize at least 6 out of the 8 primary resources that I have assigned, and also key terms and content from the reading and from the modules assignment to ultimately type your response to the essay, okay? As of right now, you do not know the question that I am asking you, okay? I understand that is a challenge. Unlike the modules where you know the question I'm asking you, right? This is the part where you need to do your preparation, right? You need to do your preparation because as of this point right now, unless you have started the quiz, right, you do not know the questions. Once you have done your preparation, once you have done your studying and review, if you will start the test. Once you start the test, the essay prompt will pop up. A timer will start with 120 minutes, and ultimately, you got to start typing, right? You got to start typing your essay. And your essay, how you will be graded. Okay, so it's 150 points. That is what your essay is worth. And these are the criteria that I'm grading you by, right? Right? Your thesis. Did you answer the question, right? Did you answer the question? And ultimately, with your thesis, how sophisticated is it, right? Your thesis is basically your answer to the question, right? That's basically it, guys. But your thesis is also a skeleton. It's a summary of ultimately what your essay is about, right? So it's very important that you have a sophisticated, in-depth, right, thesis that correlates the content that you will be discussing, right, to answer the question, okay? And then ultimately, all right, argumentative development, basically, how detailed is your writing, right? What kind of evidence are you using, right? Is the type of evidence you are using relevant to the question? Does it support the main ideas, the main points that you are trying to make, right? So this is where ultimately, right, the history content from the textbook, from the modules, right, is relevant, right? You need to think about what you have learned in the textbook from chapter 16 through 22, right? Reconstruction, industrialization, American expansion overseas, World War I, right? Think about those themes and concept and time period and how it relates to the question and what type of examples and evidence from the textbook, from modules 1 through 5, right? Themes, concept, events you will use to help you answer the question, okay? So what are you going to use, right? That's what you're going to be somewhat graded upon. Of course, documents, right? The documents. So I will talk about the documents in a little bit here, but as you can see here, I have documents, right? Document number one is the 14th Amendment. Document number 2 is a passage of writing from W.E.B. Du Bois. These are all primary resources, firsthand account of American history, right? Relevant to the time period that you have looked at. So your usage of the document. Now, just a quick warning here. I know some of you are going to be confused, even though we already did the sample document, the sample DBQ assignment where I gave you sample essays, right, from students. And I hope you take my feedback and my somewhat response, my comments back to you into consideration. If you notice in the sample DBQ, even the worst essay, which should be essay number 3, even the worst essay, right? If you notice, none of them wrote something like this, right? Document number 1 is about this, right? And then a whole paragraph about document number 1. And then in the next paragraph, document number 2 is about this. And they would, and then they would write more details about document number 2. Document number 3 is about this. Guys, do not make your essay, do not make the documents be the main focus of your essay. Do not make the documents your topic sentence for your paragraph. That is dangerous because why? What I'm looking for you to do is ultimately, how do you use the documents? Can you contextualize it, right? And what relevant information beyond the document are you bringing, right? And synthesizing content from the reading, from the modules, from the documents to create our argumentative essay, okay? I'm just warning you right now because I can already see it. This always happens no matter how many times I say this in the video. Do not provide to me 6 paragraphs, all right? And 6 summaries of what each document is about. I promise you. I have students that always do this to me, and it frustrates me because I'm telling you not to do it. They'll say something like this: well, in document number 1, it's about the 14th Amendment. What document number 1 says is that all persons are born and naturalized in the United States, so blah, 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 right? Document number 1 is also was ratified in 1868, right? They would tell me things like that. Guys, that is very repetitive, right? And this is an exam of your historical knowledge, not an eye exam, guys. I mean, obviously, yes, all that information is conveyed, is already provided to you. But what I'm looking for is, do you understand how the 14th Amendment, document number 1, right? Do you understand how it relates to the question? Do you understand the context of document number 1? What is the historical context of document number 1? What other relevant information can you bring along with document number 1 to help you answer the question? So guys, at the end of the day, guys, it's not an eye exam, right? What I'm looking for is ultimately how sophisticated, how in-depth is your analysis, and are you able to contextualize, giving me the context behind these documents and using these documents to answer the question, right? Think of the documents as kind of like a jigsaw puzzle that I'm giving you, and the documents are the big pieces, right? These are topics, themes, events, people that I want you to focus on. It's my way of letting you know, hey, talk about these things in your essay, but you got to go beyond what is just in the documents. You got to bring me relevant information, right? That's exactly where it gets to the next point, is that do you understand somewhat the author's point of view, the author's thesis, what purpose, why did they write what they wrote, right? Why did they write what they wrote? And ultimately, what is the context, right? What is the context, the historical context to these documents, if you will, right? So sourcing the documents, and then of course, contextualizing the document, right? Understanding how does the documents, right, relate to the larger time period, and how does that larger time period relates to the question, okay? And then last but not least, this is key, guys. You also have key terms in the textbook, right? You need to be detailed, right? And the sophistication of your argument, right? How comprehensive your understanding of the content, right? The more specific you are, the more sophisticated your analysis is, the more detailed you are, the more comprehensive your analysis is. So guys, at the end of every chapter, if you notice, you got key terms, right? The textbook is letting you know, hey, these are the key terms that you have learned in the chapter, if you will. I'm trying to figure out, are you able to relate some of those key terms, right, to somewhat the documents and also the essay question? The key word here, guys, is relevant key terms, right? And this is where you need to go beyond the document. So for example, document number 1, yes, obviously it's the 14th Amendment, but are there relevant key terms, right, that could go along with the 14th Amendment to give you context, right, and to allow you to understand the time period of the 1860s that would allow you to correlate the information back to the essay question? So yes, guys, that's what your essay, that's what your grade is based upon, right? Your thesis, your argument, right? Your usage of the document, your comprehension of the content, right? And ultimately, how detailed is your writing? How detailed is your analysis? That's what I'm looking for. So yes, your grade is based on all of that. That's why I haven't made a rubric, if you will, because I like to use a comprehensive approach, right? There would just be too many things that I would have to like break down in a rubric, but this is as short as sweet as I can give you, right? These are the criteria that you will be graded upon. So that's my expectations. That's the criteria of what you're going to be graded upon. So I hope you understand that. So let's talk about the documents. Yes, here are the documents that you're going to be working with. 6 out of the 8 must be part of your analysis, guys, okay? So here, I'm going to take a little time to just give you some themes and some ideas that you may focus on and why I have chose these documents to assign to you. Guys, I have a plan, right? I have a plan in mind of how your essay should go. And basically, this is my way of giving you breadcrumbs, if you will, to let you know, hey, these are the themes that I want you to focus on. And I already told you day one that I'm really big on looking at American history from a bottom social perspective, if you will. So it's not a coincidence, some of these documents that you see here. So I'm going to talk about it for a second. Let me get some water here. Okay, so document number 1, yes, it's the 14th Amendment. This is the amendment that was passed during Reconstruction, if you will, to ultimately give African Americans their rights as citizens, right? Their rights as citizens. So what is the context here, right? Why was the 14th Amendment passed? Why did it needed to be passed? Because if you remember, Southerners were not very cooperative after the Civil War. They wanted to put African Americans back in their place. If you remember in module number 1, I asked you to look at somewhat, right, the Black codes, if you will, right? That there were mechanisms and institutions that Southerners tried to create to try to trap African Americans back on the land, if you will. So this is the 14th Amendment, right? Congress felt the need that they needed to pass this to protect African Americans and their rights as citizens. The 14th Amendment is a really important amendment because what it states is that ultimately, right? Your rights as citizens, right, is based on birth. If you're born in America, you have rights as a citizen. But also the 14th Amendment is very significant in this sense, is that it says, right, there's a second clause where it says that ultimately, right, you have the right of equal protection and due process. Right? We call it the equal protection clause, if you will, that you have the right to be treated equally before the law. So if you look at it, I'm assigning you this document because I want you to think about African Americans in the 1860s. I want you to think about somewhat the promises that were made to them, the freedoms that they had, that they exercised, but also the challenges that they face, and ultimately the failures of Reconstruction. That's what it's about, guys. Like, that's why I'm assigning you the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment itself is a foundation for the modern civil rights movement, if you will, right? That people of all color are going to use the 14th Amendment as their right to be treated equally before the law, if you will. So this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should review African Americans in the 1860s, especially about their rights, right? And the challenges that they face, and ultimately, how ultimately the federal government failed to fulfill the promises of the 14th Amendment, right? That's what I'm looking for you to do. So some key terms that could possibly go along with this, yeah, black codes, right? Key terms that could go along with this, black codes, right? You got the KKK in the 1860s, if you will, right? To try to put African Americans back in their place here, right? Let me see what other key terms could go along with this, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1866, all right? Let's see, you got the 15th Amendment. It's also relevant as well, right? To protect African Americans and their right to vote, right? So those are some of the relevant key terms that you may want to think about that correlates to the 14th Amendment, if you will, okay? So think about Reconstruction. That's the point of document number one. All right, let's go to document number two. Here you have somewhat a document that was written by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, if you don't know who W.E.B. Du Bois was, think of him as kind of like the late 19th century, early 20th century version of Martin Luther King, but without the religious component, if you will, right? Great civil rights leader, founder of the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois, during World War I, called on African Americans to take advantage of the opportunity they have been given to go serve during World War I as an opportunity to fight for their freedom and democracy. All right? That's what he's talking. That's what he's calling on African Americans to go to war about. But unfortunately, once those African American soldiers came back home, unfortunately, the very thing that they were fighting for were left unfulfilled. Right? So he's talking about African American soldiers coming back home, and W.E.B. Du Bois is expressing his disappointment, right? And he is expressing his somewhat disillusion with the promises that were made, if you will, during World War I towards African Americans. And what he writes in here is really symbolic of the injustice and the hypocrisy that African Americans experienced during World War I, that ultimately they put their lives on the line to go fight for their freedom and democracy, only to return home. And ultimately, yeah, that's what he's talking about in document number two. So I don't want to give too much away, right? He's expressing his disappointment and his disillusion, if you will. So I want you to read this document and understand what happened to African Americans once they got home, right, to the land of freedom and democracy. Now, document 1 and 2, what I have in mind is they actually go together in this sense, is that they're both relevant to African Americans, right? One is in 1860s. W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about African Americans during World War I. So basically, this is my way of letting you know, of forcing you to analyze the African American experience, right, during the time periods that we have covered so far. Look at their experience, guys, starting from the 1860s all the way up to World War I, right? You can look at African Americans as saying, well, you know, they got the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. But if you look at it, it was also a time period of disappointment. Is that by the 1890s, Southerners were back, right? So, white supremacy was once again the law of the land. And by 1896, you have the Plessy versus Ferguson case that basically ruled that segregation was now legal, right? And ultimately, African Americans were disfranchised and had their rights stripped away from them. So basically, document number 1 and document number 2, I'm really forcing you to ultimately examine American history from the perspective of African Americans from the years 1860s to 1920 to the end of World War I. So that's what document 1 and 2, ultimately, that's what I have in mind, guys. The focus is on African Americans, and those are the main themes that you need to focus on, right? The promises that were made to African Americans, and also the failure of the American government to fulfill those promises to African Americans, if you will. So that's basically the first 2 documents. Document number 3. All right, document number 3 is from a Filipino, Emilio Aguinaldo. And this is covering ultimately American expansion overseas, especially in the Pacific, in the Philippines. We often forget that the Philippines was once an American territory, an American colony for the first half of the 20th century, if you will. So what is the context to this document? Well, basically, Emilio Aguinaldo, he's a Filipino. They were fighting for their independence, if you will. And ultimately, he is writing this letter to the American public, appealing to their democratic values and promises that were made to his people, if you will. Yes, the Americans promised the Filipinos that ultimately they were going to bring them freedom and independence. Basically, the Philippines used to belong to the Spanish. The Americans went to war during the Spanish-American War over Cuba, but they got ultimately the Philippines as well. And once they defeated the Spanish, the Filipinos believed that the Americans were on their side, the Americans were going to be their liberators, and that the Americans are going to usher in an era of freedom and independence into the Philippines, if you will. Because that's what America promised them. That's what America said that it was about. It's a force of freedom and democracy, if you will. But that is not the case in the Philippines, right? That ultimately America retracted on its promises, and that ultimately there was another bloodier war that dragged out in the Philippines. So that's what document number 3 is about. So I want you to read it, and I want you to see what Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Filipino nationalists, right, of the Filipino people, if you will, what he has to say about the contradiction between what America promised to his people and what they actually did in the Philippines, right? So this is his argument, right? He's writing this to the American public, right? And he's a Filipino. So this is my way to let you know, hey, you need to think about the nature of America's expansion overseas. How does America present itself, and how does its action and its policies match up to what it tries to present itself to be? There's perception, guys, and there's reality. Do those things match up when it comes to American expansion? That is something that I'm asking you to analyze. So this is my way of letting you know, hey, think about what happened out in the Pacific, right? The Philippines, what relevant information you can bring along with this, Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, right? And the nature of American expansion, all right? That's what you're looking at in document number 3. Document number 4, this is written by a pamphlet that was written by the National Women's Party in 1917 as a way to somewhat protest and also to put pressure on Congress to give women the right to vote, all right? So if you read this very carefully, the National Women's Party is explaining to the American public why they were picketing outside of the White House, and ultimately why it was an injustice for America, the home of democracy, right, to not give women the right to vote. Just think about that, guys, right? In the land of democracy, almost half of your population, because, you know, women, they're half of the human species, if you will, right, do not have the right to vote. So what does that say about American democracy? So this is something that I want you to think, I want you to read, think about the experience of women and their quest to vote, right, in the time period that we have examined, the American women's suffrage movement, as we call it, the struggle of women to get their right to vote. It's a long struggle, guys, that date back to the 1840s. You learn a little bit about the women's suffrage movement, right, in the 1860s, if you will, in the reading. But in one of the modules, I also assigned to you a lot of material on the women's suffrage. So yes, I'm expecting you to use some of the content from the modules as well to help you tell a fuller story of the women's suffrage movement as well, okay? Document number 5, here you have the platform of the Progressive Party, if you will, under their candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, right? Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican, but ultimately he became a progressive by the election of 1912 because he felt that his successor, President Taft, did not fulfill the promises of the progressive movement, if you will. So here you have the progressive platform. They're stating what their campaign is about. So this is my way of letting you know, review the progressive movement starting from the 1890s onward, right? What did the progressive movement represent? How was it a response to ultimately the problems of industrialization, and ultimately, look at the title, guys, A Charter for Democracy. What are they really fighting here, right? What are they really somewhat, what type of issues are they focusing on, right? That's what I want you to focus on, right? The progressive response to the problems of industrialization and the solutions and the ideas that the progressives were fighting for, right? A Charter for Democracy, right? Document number 5. Looking at the progressive itself, right? Document number 6. So this is another somewhat platform, foundational declaration statement from the Populist Party. This is a predecessor to the progressive, the Populists in the 1890s. These were farmers and workers coming together to address, same thing the progressives will eventually address, the problems of industrialization, okay? Here they write about somewhat the problems that they are facing and somewhat the problems of capitalism, right? And the problems of industrialization. So I want you to think about the populist movement, what they believe to be the responsibilities of the federal government. What should the primary duties of the federal government be? Should it be to serve the interests of the corporations, of the bankers, of the industrialists, or should it be on the side of the people, right? That's what I want you to somewhat think about when it comes to the populist movement, if you will. So yeah, this was their platform that was written at Omaha to really create a third party that was called the People's Party, but we call it the populist movement, if you will, in the 1890s, okay? So that's document number 6. I want you to look at the populist movement in the 1890s, all right? Document number 7, this is a document about Woodrow Wilson and the goals of World War I, right? Woodrow Wilson, he's very idealistic, also very religious, right? He sees World War I as an opportunity for America to really project its democratic ideals onto the rest of the world. Now, whether he was successful in somewhat accomplishing these goals or not, that's another story. But this is an effort that the Americans do try to explain to the rest of the world as to why they are getting involved in World War I. So I want you to read this document and understand the goals that the Americans established as to why we are getting involved in World War I. If you click on the link there, you will see the full 14 points that he lays out. This is my way of letting you know, hey, you should think about America's involvement during World War I. Why did America get involved in World War I? What were our interests? What were our goals? And ultimately, how successful were we, right? So that's what document number 7 is about, guys. World War I, America's involvement during World War I. And ultimately, we get to the last document here. This document is written by Captain Richard Pratt. He is the founder, the creator of these things we call the American boarding schools, Okay, so if you click on the link, it actually has some background information to help you understand the document a little further. But basically, these were the what we call the Carlisle schools, if you will, in the 1890s that were established to ultimately to civilize and to assimilate Native Americans. So here the captain is writing what is the goal of the Carlisle school, if you will. And if you read this passage very carefully, he explains to you what the goals of these schools are when it comes to dealing with Native Americans, right? I think you can see from the title, it's very clear what the objective is: to kill the Indian and to save the man, right? This is my way of letting you know, think about Native Americans, especially in the 1870s all the way up until the 1890s, how they were treated, how the federal government ultimately dealt with them, if you will, the nature of Western expansion, and how did America justify ultimately what happened out west of the Mississippi. Native Americans will tell you what happened to them as genocide, but here you have the Americans' defense, the American perspective of how they justify their actions out in the West, right? But ultimately, this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should think about Native Americans out in the West, right? So if you look at it, guys, these documents, there are some big topics for you to somewhat look at here, right? You got stuff on Native Americans. You got stuff on World War I. Let's see here. You got stuff on the populist movement, the progressive movement. You got stuff on the women's suffrage movement. You have stuff on American expansion overseas, in the Philippines, in the Caribbeans, right? In the Pacific. You have stuff on African Americans from the 1860s. You have stuff on African Americans all the way up until the 1920s. Those are big topics, right? So that's what the documents are about, right? I want you to think about those topics and start brainstorming, right? Start preparing your content, have your notes, have these documents, understand what they're about, right? Go back in the textbook and ultimately look for some relevant key terms that could go along with these documents to help you to tell a more comprehensive story of the experiences of these people and movements and events that I am trying to get you to discuss here. African Americans, women, Native Americans, right? American expansion overseas, in the Pacific, in the Caribbeans, in World War I. That's what it's about, guys, right? So ultimately, we're looking at people, we're looking at movements, and we're looking at expansion. That's what we're looking at. So ultimately, those are the themes, concepts, and guys, at the end of the day, I'm going to simplify in this sense. You're retelling me the story. Don't overthink it. That's what history is about. All historians, what do? We analyze these documents, we synthesize everything that we have learned, but then we write stories. And in a good story, you should always go in chronological order. That is it, right? I'm just trying to help you and simplify the process for you. Go in chronological order, right? When you're writing your essay, right? So that way you ultimately understand. It just helps you tell an easier story. Now, let me prevent any confusion here. What I'm saying is, I don't want you to write me a chronology of events. That's not what it's about, because some of you are going to say, well, this happened in 1860s, this happened in 1870s, and this happened in 1880s. No, guys. At the end of the day, you need to answer the question. You need to use the content, right? You need to use the documents. You need to use concepts, themes, key terms from the textbook, and also content from the modules to help you answer the question. At the end of the day, you are answering the question. But in answering the question, you need to use the documents. You need to put them in the proper context, right? You need to go in somewhat in proper order, in an organized manner, so that way I don't have to read your paper 2 or 3 times, right, to ultimately understand what you're talking about. And also, if you need a model, guys, look at your textbook, right? Would it make sense if your textbook goes something like this? Well, let's talk about African Americans in the 1860s. And then in the next chapter, it's like, okay, let's talk about during World War I in the 1910s. And then in the chapter after that, they go, okay, let's go back to talk about Native Americans in the 1870s. if you notice in your textbook, right, they go in chronological order, right? They go in chronological order. So I want you to think about the themes, the type of peoples that you have examined, and the time period that we have covered. And that's basically what it's about, guys. You're going to have to piece it all together and write me a cohesive, organized, detailed essay. And you're going to have to do it under 2 hours, right? 2 hours. You have 2 hours to complete the test. And what I recommend you do is preparation, 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 right? Set aside as much time as possible, okay? Ultimately, review the content from the textbook, review content from the modules, and review the documents, because at least 6 out of the 8 documents need to be in your essay, okay? And at the end of the day, guys, answer the question. So here's my recommendation to you. Once you start the quiz, right, take the first 5 minutes to do the following things. Number one, set a timer on your phone or on an alarm clock or something. But look, guys, we all have phones now, okay? Set a timer on your phone, 30 minutes. Set a timer, 30 minutes. Once you start the test, start the timer on your phone for 30 minutes. So that way, right, every 30 minutes, it's just a checkpoint for you to understand, oh, okay, I got 90 minutes left. I have an hour left. I have half an hour left. Because why? I get this all the time. Students will tell me, oh my God, Professor Nguyen, I ran out of time, right? So that timer, that 30-minute timer on your phone is to keep you in check, right? To make sure that you are on pace and that ultimately you are conscious of the time. So set a timer, number one. Number two, here's my advice. Take the first couple of minutes to read the question very carefully. Read the question very carefully. Analyze the question and understand exactly what the question is asking you to do, okay? Read the question, guys, very carefully, okay? Once you read the question, ultimately, then create an outline, right? Create an outline. Basically, okay, what is the question asking me to do, okay? Then create an outline. Think about content. Think about documents that you're going to be using, key terms that you're going to be using, and then ultimately create a roadmap, right? Create an outline, right? In paragraph number one, I'm going to have an introduction. I'm going to have a thesis. Paragraph number two, I'm going to focus on so-and-so. Paragraph number number three, I'm going to focus on so-and-so. I'm going to use this document. I'm going to use this key term because it answers the question in this way, right? That's what I recommend you doing, right? So you got, look, I don't have a problem with you having notes in front of you, right? But you got to be careful. Do not copy word for word from the textbook, okay? Because I promise you guys, like, that is plagiarism, guys. So what you need to do is, as part of your preparation, you need to put things in your own words, right? Summarize things in your own words. What is document number one about? What is document number two about? What is document number three about? You need to write it in your own words, guys, okay? So create an outline. In the first couple of minutes, just breathe, read the question, create an outline, right? Double check your outline and then start writing. Start writing, guys, right? Start writing, if you will, right? And ultimately pay attention to the time. And then ultimately the last 5 minutes of the test, stop and proofread your essay. Proofread your essay to make sure that ultimately it makes sense. There's no typos because, guys, it's 2020 now. There's a somewhat spell check we have available on there. Please correct yourself and make sure that your writing is up to par, okay? So read the question carefully, create an outline, and proofread, right, before you submit, if you will. But other than that, guys, I hope this video has been informative to you, right? And I hope you're paying attention. And just the fact that you stuck around, I know this has been a very somewhat long video, if you will, but I hope this video has been informative. But before you turn this off, okay, I don't want to share with you something, okay? Let me see here. I want to share with you something, okay? So, not to give it away or anything like that, but this is what I typically do in my in-person class. I always start my History 17B course with a passage from President George W. Bush. Right, this is Bush number 2, 2001. And ultimately, in his inauguration, George Bush basically talked about the history of America, right? And in the following passage, he says basically the following. He says, we have a place, right? All of us, he's talking about the American people, in a long story, a story we continue, but whose end we will not see. It is a story of a new world that became a friend and liberator of the old. The story of a slave-holding society that became a servant of freedom. A story of a power that went into the world to protect and not to possess, to defend and not to conquer. It is the American story, a story of a flawed and fallible people united across the generations by grand and enduring ideals. The grandest of these ideals is an unfolding American promise that everyone belongs, that everyone deserves a chance, that no significant person was ever born. Okay? I think this is a very interesting passage, and I typically use it to start my 17B course to set the foundation of basically saying, okay, this is what George Bush says that the history of America is about. How valid is it? Okay? That's usually how I start my History 17B class, guys. And not to give it away, I actually use this passage, right, as an example and as context, right, as a somewhat question, right, to ask my students to evaluate the history that they learned from the 1860s to 1920, right, to see how true Bush's statement holds up. So I don't know. What do you think? All right, what do you think? Everything you have learned so far, what do you think? Do you think Bush is right? Or do you think ultimately, right, it's invalid? To what extent? That's all I can tell you. I can't give you the question, guys, but that's all I can tell you, that you can be sure George Bush will pop up again on midterm number 1, and that ultimately you're going to have to do the same thing that my students do for their first midterm in my class as well, to assess, right, the content that they have learned from the 1860s to 1920 with the various experiences that we have looked at: African Americans, Native Americans, women, populist, progressive, American expansion overseas, America's involvement during World War I. How valid is Bush's statement? That's all I can tell you, right? I can't give you the question, but the fact that you stuck around for this long, think of it as a bonus, all right, guys? So if you need any help, questions, if you have any questions, if you need further guidance, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to help you, right, with this exam. But guys, that's what you have, right? Ultimately, you write me an essay, 1,000 words, utilizing 6 of the 8 documents, content, key terms, concepts from the reading, from the modules, right? And ultimately, you have 2 hours. I know it's a tall task, but it's not a new task I'm asking you to do. And I'm fully confident, right? If you do your preparation, you will be in great shape for the exam. But on that, guys, best of luck. And if you have any further question, right, feel free to reach out to me. All right. Thanks, guys. Good luck.